The fifth panelist today joining us is David Mednicoff. Happy to see him here again at this conference and to have the opportunity to listen to his remarks. David is the chair of the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at UMass and is speaking to us today about the rule of law and democracy's denial in contemporary Arab politics. Lessons learned, but more importantly, I'm eager to hear about strategies for change. David?
Thanks so much, and I also want to thank Dr. Mahmoudi and everybody, because I think that the opportunity to really be in a space not only where we're talking about democracy in the Middle East, but doing it in a democratic and open way it's very hard to find now. So it's wonderful to be here. So I want to talk about the rule of law. The rule of law is probably the last global political ideal that governments and people tend to champion, at least rhetorically. But I'm going to argue that we need to understand the rule of law as contested and diverse, and also consonant with the realities of legal politics in the MENA and elsewhere, and the challenges to democracy globally. And so let me start with the United Nations definition, and I'm going to be whipping through a lot of material very quickly. My response to time diminishments is to be a fast talker, so please forgive me. And so, the UN definition, which USAID and many others adopt, and it's reasonable to do so, says that the rule of law is a principle where all people, including national governments, are accountable to laws that are independently adjudicated and consistent with international human rights and standards. In other words, the rule of law is best understood, or most commonly understood, is about constraining government and also being kind of more broadly consistent with liberal democratic norms. And so this is, I think, a very common way, shorthand, that a lot of folks might think about the rule of law, that there's this kind of virtuous circle between the rule of law and democratization. I'd like to call it the Reese's peanut butter cup paradigm. Like chocolate and peanut butter are great tastes that taste great together. So democracy and the rule of law are these wonderful things that go completely well together. And my work on the politics of the rule of law in the Middle East and more globally pushes back a little bit against this, because what I want to show briefly, and then get into some data from work I've actually done in the region, is that rule of law can mean a lot of different things, and those things don't necessarily always reinforce democracy, so we have to think about how they actually work. And another popular culture way of appreciating this is a TV show like Law and Order actually talks about how essentially one vision of the rule of law from this TV show that's continues in its forms combines policing. Law actually refers to the police in this TV show, and order refers to the legal pieces. And so right there you have encapsulated this idea that the rule of law contains dimensions that are both about law enforcement and about rights. And those two things are not necessarily always consistent, certainly when we're talking about democratization. Now, organizations that try to measure the rule of law obviously do understand that this is complex. The World Justice Project, which I think is now the leader of rule of law measurements, has a variety of criteria that are all embedded under this term, the rule of law. And again, if you look at them, what you see is some of these things are about order or preventing corruption, which can be done, and indeed can be done very well, under highly repressive political systems. And others are about freedoms and things that we might associate with democratization. And of course, organizations like this do this deliberately so that we understand the rule of law as something that's complex. But then on the other hand, many of us seek simple numbers, an index. And so if you take all the stuff together and you look at a number about how countries do, for example, the UAE looks quite good. It's 37th globally, and it's a yay, rule of law in the UAE. But then when you look at where it excels and where it doesn't, I mean, these are dimensions that are not necessarily leading to democratization. Similarly, when we look at the World Bank indicators, governance indicators, the Middle East and North Africa, isn't terrible on the rule of law. And I appreciate that obviously in Egypt, under its present government, it's towards the bottom. But, Gulf Arab countries fare quite well. This, as you probably know, these are percentiles. So most countries in the Middle East and North Africa are better on the rule of law by this governance indicator than the majority of countries in the world. But when you look at other governance indicators that are more about indicators of democracy, this is where Middle East countries don't do so well. That was the Voice and Accountability World Bank indicator, and this is the Freedom of Expression Index from Article 19 organization, which shows most Middle Eastern and North Africa countries not just bad on freedom of expression, but in deep crisis. That's what the dark red shows. So when you look at governance indicators altogether, this idea that rule of law actually tells us that states are moving towards liberal democracy or consistent with liberal democratic norms is somewhat undermined. And this is why rule of law politics is this kind of global thing where lots of countries will put on shows around the rule of law and show that they really, or argue that they're really committed to the rule of law. But it's exactly because these norms are so contestable that they can do that while scoring low on exactly some of the features that are most prominent in a definition like the UN's. So what I want to say theoretically in a very simple way is that instead of thinking about the rule of law in this Reese's peanut butter cup paradigm, as much as I love Reese's peanut butter cups personally, one simple way to think of it is more of a sort of a seesaw where, norms can either be or both authoritarian leaning or democratic leaning, and they're contested. It's a constant sort of contest, and that's how I want us to sort of think about it. So what I want to do now is summarize very briefly some data that I was very privileged to collect a while ago, and it's hard to do this kind of work, so if anybody out there is interested in replicating this work or has some funding, please talk to me. I'm looking to redo this. So what I was able to do through a grant from the Qatar National Research Fund was really look at how law students and aligned students in Qatar and Kuwait and lawyers, in the region talked about the rule of law. We did surveys, detailed surveys in Arabic on, what does the rule of law mean to you? And what the data really show is exactly what I'm sort of saying. People care about the rule of law. There's a lot of contestation about the rule of law, but it doesn't fit into some simple government ought to be limited by law category, nor does it connect necessarily to the idea that international legal norms are the way to think about the rule of law. And again, this is not to say that this contestation can't be connected to democratization in some way. So with the limited time that I have, I'm not really even, I'd love to go over some of this data. It's really rich, and I don't think people have seen surveys of lawyers and law students. But what I'm just going to cut to what it says. And I also have a lot of remarks from Qatari and non-Qatari lawyers that really emphasize that international lawyers tend to come with this kind of neo-imperial mindset of, lawyers in the country don't know what they're doing. And the lawyers in the country have a very rich discourse around what they think that they're doing. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not what I meant to show. So, again, the summary of all this data is that there is a lot of contestation around rule of law norms, but they're framed often in different terms than simple Western-centered definitions might suggest. And because rule of law norms are contested so much, but they're not often unpacked in this contestational way, it's easy for governments to take advantage of that to really obscure the disconnection between what they are doing in terms of parts of the rule of law and the possibilities of democratization. So in terms of what's ways forward, I would not argue, and I'm happy to talk more in the QA, that one should give up on the idea of the global rule of law. I don't think that serves the challenges that the region is facing that are, obviously dramatic and heartbreaking. But I do think that rule of law framing and promotion can take advantage of the way that local values are contested. And I think that, organizations are leading to do this. USAID has a new strategy that's called People-Centered Justice. And we just heard from IFAS, that this kind of bottom-up approach is really becoming more and more important. The other thing that I would bring to the mix that we haven't talked about at all today is that I do think that regional institutions, regional approaches to big problems, including the rule of law, are really worth considering. I mean, after all, one of the ways that international law, human rights developed well in Europe was through regionalization. And so what I would very much, what I work on in a lot of other ways in the region is thinking about as bad as regional institutions have a record, how, what might emerge from the current reshuffling in the Middle East and North Africa is a focus on regional institutions that could also start thinking more broadly about adapting norms around the rule of law to more local realities. Thank you very much.